From A Child's Christmas in Wales by Dylan Thomas. Years and years ago, when I was a boy, when there were wolves in Wales, and birds the color of red flannel petticoats whisked past the harp-shaped hills, when we sang and wallowed all night and day in caves that smelt like Sunday afternoons in damp front farmhouse parlors, and we chased, with the jawbones of Dickens, the English and the bears, before the motor car, before the wheel, before the duchess-faced horse, when we rode the daft and happy hills bareback, it snowed and it snowed. But here a small boy says, it snowed last year too. I made a snowman and my brother knocked it down, and I knocked my brother down, and then we had tea. But that was not the same snow, I say. Our snow was not only shaken from whitewash buckets down the sky, it came shawling out of the ground and swam and drifted out of the arms and hands and bodies of the trees. Snow grew overnight on the roofs of the houses like a pure and grandfather moss, minutely ivied the walls, and settled on the postman opening the gate like a dumb, numb thunderstorm of white, torn Christmas cards. Were there postmen then, too? With sprinkling eyes and wind-cherried noses, on spread frozen feet they crunched up to the doors and mittened on them manfully. But all that the children could hear was a ringing of bells. You mean the postman went rat-a-tat-tat and the doors rang? I mean that the bells the children could hear were inside them. I only hear thunder sometimes, never bells. There were church bells, too. Inside them? No, in the bat-black, snow-white belfries, tugged by bishops and storks, and they rang their tidings over the bandaged town, over the frozen foam of the powder and ice-cream hills, over the crackling sea. Thank you, Dylan Thomas, for that. Welcome to the latest Floating Poetry broadcast, and thank you for leaning in to the 55th show in my ongoing weekly series. Coming to you live again, live from Shelter Harbor, from the free and easy coast of Rhode Island. This is your poet and poetorialist Colin Goedecke, a voice for living our days more poetically, more expressively, more soulfully. Last week, we mused on the sun, moon, and stars. This week, I'm inviting you to dial up or sail back into childhood, into its wonderments, its footlooseness, all that rampant curiosity and spontaneity, and look at keeping a childlike quality of yourself, ourselves, alive, whatever age or place of life and self you've grown to be in. I've quilted together all kinds of cultural commentary for us, poetry, thoughts, and what I hope may be good thought and feeling sparkings. So, ragazzi, kids and heart of all ages, ladies and gentlemen, off we go. I thought we'd start with a little conceptual framework, the concept of childhood and historical background, just a bit of a taste of that from summaryplanet.com. This was very interesting. They speak here, they're saying, the manner of children's recognition by adults and patterns of child care changed through the passage of time. We might have the impression that in the Middle Ages, until the 12th century, there was no place for childhood in art and in society in general. It seems society was not aware of the existence of the concept of childhood when it is suggested that the concept did not exist in early medieval society. The adults were not fully aware of the difference between them and children. The first evidence that society became aware of that difference is the fact they came to be portrayed and depicted in paintings and literature. With the only exception of Jesus, children were scarcely portrayed in medieval paintings, and they were not portrayed as children in modern times, but they looked like adults. You probably noticed that. We can see that the 17th century played a crucial role in the changes of attitudes toward children in some ways. The 18th century was even more important, manifested by the fact that in the second half of that century, and the 19th, we can already find writers who produced books for children. Jigsaws, games, and various toys became available for them. We also noticed that a great change in parent-child relations took place in the upper classes of society. More and more children there started to call their parents mother and father instead of sir or madam. Until that century, parents had not spent much time with their children, who were often left to governesses and wet nurses in that class. So parents became more affectionate, more permissive, and families became more child-oriented. Mainly, mothers changed their priorities and became strongly attached to children. Well, they said in this piece, we should bear in mind that this was the case of upper classes. In lower middle-class families, strict discipline was demanded, and we might gain the impression that the children were not treated so affectionately in some of those families throughout the whole 18th and early 19th century. Well, I found that quite fascinating, and that led me to think of Charles Dickens, who, of course, children figure large in his stories, whether it's David Copperfield and Oliver Twist and so on. So I looked for a few writings on that and found someone had done a thesis for a PhD in Australia, Barbara Brooke, and she wrote about Dickens' child characters and his techniques. But what I thought was interesting in her abstract and sort of the summary in the beginning, she said it was Dickens who first showed how child characters could make an important contribution to novels for adult readers. No previous novelist had recognized, far less explored, the possibilities of the child as unconventional observer. This lack of precedent obliged him to evolve new narrative techniques for portraying these characters. In addition, he was faced with the problem of persuading his adult readers that the child could be of interest in his or her own right, rather than as a comic or pathetic object or moral example. Well, in the course of his career, she said, he created and improved a method that was appropriate to his new concept of child characterization and made it very acceptable to adult readers. So where the child's own vision was carefully controlled by the implied presence of an adult narrator. So you have David Copperfield, that story, which is wonderful, and there's been some great renditions on film of that, in which the child's view is of central importance. The child observer, though, is never left completely alone, but is always guided and supported by the adult voice. Well, there you have that. I was looking up some interesting quotes I thought might be interesting about childhood. Kierkegaard, he said, contemplating childhood is like contemplating a beautiful region as one rides backwards. One really becomes aware of the beauty at that moment, that very instant when it begins to vanish. Let's see, who else do I have here? C.S. Lewis of Narnia Stories, his tales. Children have one kind of silliness, as you know, and grown-ups have another kind. Nelson Mandela, there can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. Oliver Wendell Holmes, pretty much all the honest truth-telling there is in the world is done by children. Dostoevsky, the soul is healed by being with children. That's beautiful. Margaret Mead, children must be taught how to think, not what to think. And Einstein, if you want your children to be intelligent, read them fairy tales. If you want them to be more intelligent, read them more fairy tales. Love that. Well, I'm going to talk actually in a little bit about fairy tales in a couple minutes, but I have a couple of poems just to bring in. There are the plays and stagings we were in, some of us as kids, many of us, and others as adults that we watched our kids or nieces, nephews, siblings, others in. And what sweetness about those, they're charming in their own way, and I'm sure we all have many memories of ourselves and others in them. I have this particular one, actually was back in 2004, and I was at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and the marvelous Pina Bausch company was performing. It was a theater piece that this was one scene in it, and in the scene, there were children on the stage, and out comes a man dressed as a cloud with a watering can, and there are the flowers. It was absolutely, I'll never forget it. And this poem came to me as I was sitting there taking it in, held it in my head. And it's called Für die Kinder, for the children. A blonde-headed, two-legged cloud with a large tin watering can, blown barefoot about by a gentle mouth, Roses rain down there and there with a bending arm, and a few puffs later floats quietly off stage. Many of us would know the classic, of course, Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll's story. But what about his children's poem, Jabberwocky? Do you know that one? It's just linguistically fun. I'm going to give it to you. Jabberwocky. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogroves, and the mome raths outgrabe. Beware the jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the jub-jub bird, and shun the frumious bandersnatch. He took his vorpal sword in hand. Long time the manxome foe he sought. So rested he by the tum-tum tree, and stood awhile and thought. And as in uffish thought he stood, the jabberwock, with eyes of flame, came whiffling through the tulgey wood, and burbled as it came. 1, 2, 1, 2, and through the vorpal blade went snicker-snack. He left it dead, and with its head he went galumphing back. And hast thou slain the jabberwock? Come to my arms, my beamish boy. O frabjous Calloo, Calais, he chortled in his joy. 'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogroves, and the mauve raths outgrabe. Thank you, Lewis Carroll. He was probably a stitch to hang out with. Maybe. I don't know. Seems he might have been. Okay, so we're sort of on that wavelength of old stories. So Jack and the Beanstalk, you're going to know this one. I always thought of this as when you think of a kid and having monsters under the bed or in the closet or your nightmares and things and seeing films and what have you, was the giant. Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread. Still scares me. So that earliest known version of that was Jack the Giant Killer. That appeared in the History of Jack and the Giants in 1711. Yeah, look at how long it's carried on. So fairy tales, they're the Grimm brothers, the Brothers Grimm, Die Brüder Grimm. Very interesting characters, actually. I didn't know as much about them as when I was doing some research for us for this. They were Hessian academics, philologists, cultural researchers, lexicographers, and authors who together collected and published folklore during the 19th century. Among the first and best-known collectors of German and European folk tales, and popularized the oral ones such as Cinderella, Aschenputtel, the Frog Prince, the Frogskönig, the Goose Girl, Hansel and Gretel, Little Red Riding Hood, the Wolf and the Seven Young Goats, Rumpelstiltskin, Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, Schneewittchen. And so they, of course, entered the literature, and it also became the way they did it became the basis for folklore studies as a whole. Very interesting. Their tales went into 100 languages, and of course we know they've been adapted by filmmakers, including Walt Disney, over time. They were interestingly used in the 30s and 40s as propaganda by the Third Reich. I don't exactly know how that happened. I didn't get into that, but that was a strange note. Anyway, so the Brothers Grimm. And then I was thinking of the great storytellers that boys loved. At least I, as a boy, and maybe my and earlier generations, is Robert Louis Stevenson and Treasure Island, which was originally called The Sea Cook, a story for boys. So it's an adventure novel. He was a Scottish author, and narrating a tale of, quote, buccaneers and buried gold. Greatly influenced the popular perceptions of pirates and treasure maps and schooners and tropical islands and one-legged seamen with parrots on their shoulders and marvelous things like that. So it's a coming-of-age story, which I'm going to talk about a little later, about coming-of-age things, because I think that's part of plays into our theme. Excuse me. Hold on. Okay. On the essence of childhood in literature, I was casting around, and this is from gradesfixer.com. In books such as The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, the reader is allowed to experience the sly, impish attitudes of one of literature's most notable characters. Along with him and his companion, the social outcast Huckleberry Finn, the primary plan of these pieces of work written by Mark Twain was to, quote, pleasantly remind adults of what they once were themselves. He wrote that in his preface to that. How about that? E.B. White of the great Charlotte's Web children's story, which as an adult is also a good read. On writing for children, when an interviewer asked him whether there was, quote, any shifting of gears when writing children's books, as opposed to the grown-up nonfiction for which he's really best known, he said, anybody who shifts gears when he writes for children is likely to wind up stripping his gears. But I don't want to evade your question. There is a difference between writing for children and for adults. I'm lucky, though, as I seldom seem to have my audience in mind when I'm at work. It's as though they didn't exist. Anyone who writes down to children is simply wasting his time. You have to write up, not down. Children are demanding. They are the most attentive, curious, eager, observant, sensitive, quick, and generally congenial readers on earth. They accept almost without question anything you present them with, as long as it's presented honestly, fearlessly, and clearly. I handed them, against the advice of experts, a mouse boy, and they accepted it without a quiver. In Charlotte's Web, I gave them a literate spider, and they took that. Thank you, E.B. White, for that. Mark Twain, you may not know that very earlier on in his time, he wrote a very not well-known 1865 children's book, Advice to Little Girls, in which he said, good little girls always show marked deference for the aged. You ought never to, quote, sass old people unless they sass you first. And just a little snippet from that, which was fun. If at any time you find it necessary to correct your brother, do not correct him with mud. Never on any account throw mud at him, because it will spoil his clothes. It's better to scald him a little, for then you obtain desirable results. You secure his immediate attention to the lessons you are inculcating, and at the same time, your hot water will have a tendency to move impurities from his person and possibly the skin in spots. Martin, what a scamp. So think of, I think, and maybe you could think of the lovely moments of times as a child with a parent, I'm thinking father and son at the moment, that we can have, or could be grandfather too. I composed this. I was observing a pair of people in the seat in front of me on a double-decker bus in London. I was going to South Kensington that particular August back in 2013, and they were having this conversation. It was wonderful, very, very wonderful. Father and son, little boy. The father, the son, and the monkey at the zoo is the poem. Atop the shiny double-decker as it winds down Fulham Road, a sandy-haired dad giggles with his sandy-haired son about being a boy like him, all of 4, at the London Zoo, where they're off to, and the monkey stealing his father's hat, then running off, and how they may meet that mischievous monkey again, gray but still spry and still sporting his dear old dad's hat, and cutting quite a figure in it among the keepers and visitors, when the jaunty fellow lights out over the gap, as he is wont to do on occasion, into the Sunday crowd for a bit of a promenade. One of the other dimensions I was thinking about is all the songs that we grew up with, or whoever, we grew up with different songs from whatever culture we're from, part of the world, and whatever time frame we grew up in or are still growing up in. So I'm wondering what your favorites might be, and just to think of those yourselves at some point, and what were the ones you loved to hear or sing or most remember. Well, I came across a piece on the effects of music on childhood development. It's from PenfieldBuildingBlocks.org. So most of us know what a great influence music has had on us as children, or can have. And they say since nearly the beginning of human history, music has been used as a force for healing. Aristotle taught that, quote, when we hear music and poetry, our very soul is altered. From Hippocrates to Native American medicine men, people have long used singing and playing instruments to cure. In modern times, scholars and doctors have researched the mysterious power of music. Some of that research has yielded incredible insights. Doctors, for example, have found that babies express preference for the same kind of music they heard while in the womb. Many studies have shown that exposing infants and babies in the womb to music helps indicate that their early music exposure and instruction have benefits on the development of their perceptual skills, which affects their language and literary abilities and spatial reasoning and more. And of course, making music with others gives them a wonderful feeling of belonging to a group. So, some thoughts you may already have thought about, but I'm adding to the mix. There was an interesting comment about that Margaret Mead, the great cultural anthropologist, made about the importance of free-reigning imagination. I guess I'll call it that. And it was relative to Santa Claus, is just one example. But she said disillusionment about the existence of a mythical and wholly implausible Santa Claus has come to be a synonym for many kinds of disillusionment with what parents have told children about birth and death and sex and the glory of their ancestors. Instead, learning about Santa Claus can help give children a sense of the difference between a, quote, fact, something you can take a picture of or make a tape recording of, something all those present can agree exists, and poetic truth, in which man's feelings about the universe or his fellow men is expressed in a symbol. So, yeah, thought that was interesting. On a note of adolescence, there was something interesting in Psychology Today as I was looking around for material for us, and thought it might be worth noting. It wasn't something I'd quite thought about. Actually, Dr. Daniel Siegel wrote this on the essence of adolescence, and he said our modern culture encourages deeply pervasive myths about it, that we hear casually in repetition, that teens are driven mad by raging hormones. Well, actually, I believed a lot of that myself. That they're just immature and need to grow up, or undeveloped cortex makes them undependable and moody. They're actually, he says, misconceptions. I think he wrote a book about this, actually. Can't remember his book is called Brainstorm. And he debunked those myths in that book. He wanted to inspire to rewire both adolescents and adults alike toward integration. He said, so we come to see it as a period of time, and adolescence as individuals filled with untapped potential. We're much more likely to see the realization of that possibility and power in positive directions. When we empower them in this way, we can inspire them to enable integration to unfold in their neural development. And he talks about the essences an emotional spark, social engagement, novelty seeking, and creative exploration, very, very important things. So he said, rather than ignoring the essence of it, what if we shaped our culture in our homes, our schools, and larger society to cherish and cultivate those qualities in our adolescence? Food for thought. The recalls, the calls of childhood, at least for me, are never ending, and maybe rightly so. And so I've got different poems here for us on different aspects of all that. One is this Kenneth Rexroth poem, which is from his 7 poems for his wife, Marta. This was the first one. In my childhood, when I first saw myself unfolded in the triple mirrors in my youth, when I pursued myself, wandering on wandering, night-bound roads like a roving, masterless dog, when I met myself on sharp peaks of ice and tasted myself dissolved in the lulling heavy sea, in the talking night, in the spiraling stars, what did I know? What do I know now of myself, of the others? Blood flows out to the fleeing nebulae and flows back, red with all the worn space of space, old with all the time of time. Thank you, Kenneth Rexroth. Billy Collins gives us this poem, Snow Day. Today we woke up to a revolution of snow. its white flag waving over everything. The landscape vanished, not a single mouse to punctuate the blankness, and beyond these windows the government buildings smothered, schools and libraries buried, the post office lost under the noiseless drift, the paths of trains softly blocked, the world fallen under this falling. In a while I will put on some boots and step out like someone walking in water, and the dog will porpoise through the drifts, and I will shake a laden branch, sending a cold shower down on us both. But for now, I am a willing prisoner in this house, a sympathizer with the anarchic cause of snow. I will make a pot of tea and listen to the plastic radio on the counter, as glad as anyone to hear the news that the Kitty Corner School is closed, the Ding Dong School closed, the All Aboard Children's School closed, the Hi-Ho Nursery School closed, along with, some will be delighted to hear, the Toadstool School, the Little School, Little Sparrows Nursery School, Little Stars Preschool, Peas and Carrots Day School, the Tom Thumb Child Center, all closed, and clap your hands, the Peanuts Play School. So this is where the children hide all day. These are the nests where they letter and draw, where they put on their bright miniature jackets, all darting and climbing and sliding, all but the few girls whispering by the fence. And now I am listening hard in the grandiose silence of the snow, trying to hear what those three girls are plotting. What riot is afoot? Which small queen is about to be brought down? Thank you, Billy Collins. Actually, that last note took me to Rita Dove's poem, Primer. That's not. There are universal experiences, so of course some of them are being included, being excluded, or bullied, or praised. I mean, the whole gamut. So here's her piece. In the 6th grade, I was chased home by the Gatlin kids, 3 skinny sisters, and rolled down bobby socks, hissing Brainiac and Mrs. Stringbean. They trod my heel. I knew my body was no big deal, but never thought to retort. Who's calling who skinny? Besides, I knew they'd beat me up. I survived their shoves across the schoolyard because my 5'0" mother drove up in her caddy to shake them down to size. Nothing could get me into that car. I took the long way home, swore I'd show them all. I would grow up. Thank you, Rita Dove. Good one. So, early school days, what were yours like? What did you love? What did you hate? What did you forget? What are you maybe starting to remember? What were you questioning then or now? Here's Gregory Orr, O-R-R, his poem Memorial Day. After our march from the Hudson to the top of Cemetery Hill, we Boy Scouts proudly endured the sermons and hot sun, while Girl Scouts lolled among graves in the maple shade. When members of the Veterans Honor Guard aimed their bone-white rifles skyward and fired, I glimpsed beneath one metal helmet the salmon-pink flesh of Mr. Weber's nose, restored after shrapnel tore it. Friends who sat near me in school died in Asia, now lie here under new stones that small flags flap beside. It's 5th grade recess. War stories. Mr. Weber stands before us and plucks his glass eye from its socket, holds it high between finger and thumb. The girls giggle and scream. The awed boys gape. The fancy pocket watch he looted from a shop in Germany ticks on his chain. Here's one about, for my friend from Kansas, a famous, fabled for him memory of his as a boy. He would tell me all these stories about his boy, and they're all wonderful, interesting, colorful. And I wrote more than a few poems about different ones, and this was one of them. It's called The Hoplung Kid, and I sent him a picture of one of the gun toters. He's got his 2 6-shooters. The Hoplung Kid of the day. Well, I can't remember the actor's name. This was written from my friend Paul Wayner. One midwesterly winter, back in time but fresh in mind, when you were on the loose and weren't selling boxes of spud nuts from a wire basket for Mrs. Townsend, you found yourself in town, looking wide-eyed through the window of Levitt's jewelry store, where past the reflections of passing car lights a Santa Claus was making merry. But standing alone at dusk, gloveless and shivering in an oversized overcoat, while the Wichita wind whistled up your sleeves, your eyes weren't fixed on old Kris Kringle. Instead, you beheld the most beautiful young lady you had ever seen, brunetely radiant, who saw you too, who soon floated out from the warmth and sparkle, scooped you up next door to Butle's to buy you a hat and gloves and let you pick whatever your 7-year-old heart desired. You passed up the pairs of Beau Brummely pigskins and fancy rabbit furs for the straight shooters, the Hoplung Cassidy ones, with the cuffs and cowboy fringe, feeling less chillier and much happier as you hopped along back home. Well, if you're wondering about that image, that's the title image for the broadcast, that was sent to me last summer by the girl, now my vintage. We're holding a basket together for First Communion at the Catholic school we went to, St. Rose of Lima in New Jersey. And after school, grade school, never saw her again, and she reached out of the blue and sent me that image, and we reconnected. It was wonderful. Lives over in Ireland. Their husband's a writer and has some children, and I loved that image because I had never seen it, and it took me all the way back to lots of times in that school and those moments and others, and including being an altar boy. So this is a poem that I wrote in the last few years, but about that time. An altered boy, A-L-T-A-R-E-D. Obviously a play on both meanings. A cassocked and surpliced boy, a censer-lighting boy, a frankincense-wreathed boy, serving at prayer-quiet altars by the elbows of solemn priests, pouring cruets of wine and water into chaste gold chalices, ringing low-held bells, listening and prostrating in Latin, later in modern vernacular, local tabernacular, holding reflecting patens under the upright chins of kneeling supplicants, ready or not to receive the Holy of Holies sacraments, aware of the rituals, the rote ceremonials, but innocently skeptical of the actual spiritual. Amen. You might enjoy, as I do and did, Mark Doty's poem, D-O-T-Y, Ararat. Wrapped in gold foil, in the search and shouting of Easter Sunday, it was the ball of the princess. It was Pharaoh's body sleeping in its golden case. At the foot of the picket fence, in grass lank with the morning rain, it was a Sunday school prize, silver for second place, gold for the triumphant little dome of Ararat. And my sister took me by the hand and led me out onto the wide, wet lawn and showed me to bend into the thick nests of grass, into the darkest green. Later I had to give it back in exchange for a prize, though I would rather have kept the egg. What might have coiled inside it? Crocuses tight on their clock springs, a bird who'd sing himself into an angel in the highest reaches of the garden, the morning's flaming arrow. Any small thing can save you. Because the golden egg gleamed in my basket once, though my childhood became an immense sheet of darkening water, I was Noah, and I was his ark, and there were 2 of every animal inside me. Thank you, Mark Doty. So we were talking about boyhood. What about girlhood? Well, here's Jonathan Galassy's poem by the same name, Girlhood. If your bearded friend helps you catch the trout barehanded in the pool of the dream, and you carry it in his pail barefoot up the rocky stream to the playhouse where he fries it in his pan, if you snip the dill for the carrots and then swim until your lips are bluer than the lake, where will it take you? Not anywhere as pure and primal as these sun-struck days, sistered by star-struck nights. Don't cloud the drowning brightness of your eyes. Don't answer my asking look with anything but the truth. Don't spill the fresh-picked raspberries on the car seat and stain your shirt with indelible blood. Or spill them, darling. How else will you know the color of crushed time? How else will you feel what it is to change and remember, to lose and absorb this summer inside you? Xylem and phloem of your leafy future already starting to spread its shade above us. Thank you, Jonathan Galassi. And here's a poem that I wrote for 2 girls, daughters of dear friends, so sisters. One fall in London in the year 2000, playing in their postage stamp garden. I was watching them. They really weren't watching me, but I was watching them. And I wrote this poem as I watched them. It's for Princess Camille and Princess Axel, the little kingdom. Out the low fairy door and just past the waterfall of party-colored ivy, a piece of lace, a red-painted palm of Chinese maple, and gold leaf after gold leaf shining on the green moss and gilding the gray slate in this matchbox garden that's filling with fall and the sound of two young girls gathering treasures from the grounds of their little kingdom. Okay. I'd read this poem another time around another theme a while back, but I'm fitting here to encore, refrain it, for a lovely little girl I know and still know, now a budding ballerina. This was back in 2007. Her name is Evelyn Dugan, and it's called The Jar of Freckles. She is absolutely wonderfully coated head to foot in freckles. One of my favorite things. I wish I had as many as that. I only have a couple in the summer. I'm mad for freckles. So this is called The Jar of Freckles. And here's her. She's got copper, penny red hair and those same colored freckles. Your mother takes it gently in hand from a hidden corner of the kitchen cupboard behind the honey, tea, and tin of homemade cookies, and brings it to your bedroom once in a while after you, in your 4-year-oldness and goodness, fall asleep, sprinkling it ever so lightly and quietly over the bridge of your nose and cheeks to add to the confetti of copper already there, replacing those freckles that have fallen from your face to the pillow during tossing or turning dreams, each speckle as precious as stardust. Loose dots of delightfulness Mom will collect and place inside the moon-blue glass jar and take back to that secret corner of the kitchen cupboard. The Jar of Freckles. So speaking of boy and girl, and I thought siblings, we all have so many experiences and stories around those of us who have siblings or cousins who can be close like that, as I did. Patricia Smith wrote this. It's from her collection, Blood Dazzler. Patricia Smith. Siblings. Arlene learned to dance backwards in heels that were too high. Brett prayed for a shaggy mustache made of mud and hair. Cindy just couldn't keep her windy legs together. Dennis never learned to swim. Emily whispered her gusts into 1,000 skins. Franklin, farsighted and anxious, bumbled villages. Gert spat her matronly name against a city's flat face. Harvey hurled a wailing child high. Irene, the baby girl, threw pounding tantrums. Jose liked the whip sound of slapping. Lee just craved the whip. Maria's thunderskirts flew high when she danced. Nate was mannered and practical. He stormed precisely. Ophelia nibbled weirdly on the tips of depressions. Philippe slept too late, flailing on a wronged ocean. Rita was a vicious flirt. She woke Philippe with rumors. Stan was born business, a gobbler of steel. Tammy crooned country, getting all the words all wrong. Vince died before anybody could remember his name. Wilma opened her maw wide, flashing rot. None of them talked about Katrina. She was their odd sister, the Blood Dazzler. Siblings. Well, obviously we've got in this constellation of relationships our children to their parents. Might strike a few notes, I thought, here, and here's poet Sharon Olds about that, the enchantment. When I say to my mother, what was a good thing about me as a child? My mother's face seems to unfurl from the center. Hibiscus in fast motion, the anthers and flounces spring out with joy. Oh, you were enchanting, she breathes. What do you mean, crazy? No sense of reality? No, she laughs with many little notes, half a scale plus grace notes. I don't know how to say it. You were just enchanting. Possessed, I asked. Brain damage? No, she smiles. There was something about you, the way you looked at things. I think I get it, that stunned look on my face in photos, that dumbstruck look, gaze of someone who doesn't understand anything. But a week later I decide it was a look of wonder. It was bemused pleasure. Days later I see it, that light on my mother's face. She loved me. And today I hear her. She did not say enchanted. The woman in whose thrall I am is in my thrall. I came into being within her silks and masses, and after we are gone, would she caper here, my first love, would you do me the honor of continued ensorceling? Thank you, Sharon Olds. Lovely. There are those memories that we taste into literally sometimes and figuratively, or take us back. Think of La Recherche de Temps Perdu, Remembrance of Things Past, the Proust epic, and the Madeleine, he bites it and it takes him all the way back to his childhood. Whether it's years, decades later, century, half a century. So this was a dear, dear friend and mentor of mine, Richard Russack, and he told me the story about a taste that he never forgot as a boy. Now he's in his early 80s. This is called Black Raspberry for him, for Richard Russack. The year was 1947. The place, Reno, Nevada. High summer. 2 boys from the east, visiting their way out west relatives, you and your brother Bert, sent to town with enough change jingling in your pockets to buy ice cream. At the parlor beside the casino. At sea among the endless flavors on offer, your brother suggests black raspberry. And it was heaven, a taste you still remember, savor, 3/4 of a century later. Well, among my own favorite memories of my father, it was absolutely great fun. He never lost his childlike quality. It was one of the most charming things about him. There were others, but that was definitely one of them. And I was thinking about, whatever your favorite memories, you might want to conjure those up at some point, and the nature of your dad and his sense of adventure that you can remember or feel. This was called the Funny Papers. I used to sit on his lap, and he loved reading what he called the Funny Papers, the comics, Sundays, and he'd read them. So this is for him. As my father called them, the Funny Papers, as my father called them, my dad at his most playful, making whimsy as I sat buoyantly, small boyishly on his lap in our sunny Sunday living room. As he played out the comic strips, read the captions, all in the characters' voices, animated in turn in funny-papered words, each little made large drawing, both of us delighting in and between the lines. When the last frame came, he kept the story going, at first without me knowing, waiting till I caught his joking, and then how we would laugh together, like 2 Katzenjammer kids. So in the mix of all these characters in our early lives, for me, I think of the relatives, but I especially think of the aunts and uncles. The aunts and uncles, there were many for me. They were very colorful characters, all of them in their different ways, both sides of the family. All memorable for me, all cherishable in their way. And I came across Joyce Sutphen's poem, The Ants. I like it when they get together and talk in voices that sound like apple trees and grapevines. And some of them wear hats and go to Arizona in the winter. And they all like to play cards. They will always be the ones who say, quote, "It is time to go now," even as we linger at the door or stand by the waiting cars. They remember someone, an uncle we never knew, and sigh, all of them together like wind in the oak trees behind the farm where they grew up. A place I remember, especially the hen house and the soft clucking that filled the sunlit yard. Thank you, Joyce Sutphen. Was a younger fellow, I told my mother, I said, I want to go out and meet some of the relatives I've heard about that sound interesting that I haven't met or nobody seems to know or have been in touch with. I'm going to go out and meet some of them. So one of those was an incredible great aunt. And I went up to Osterville, Massachusetts, up on the Cape to find her and spend a couple days with her. Because I think if I'd ever met her, I was such an infant, I wouldn't have known her, remember her. She was amazing. And this poem is to honor her that I wrote back in 94, years after she passed on. Catherine the Great, it's called. I shall miss great Aunt Catherine, the magic in her innocent blue eyes, her young girl's smile, her regal loveliness, a queen mother who sang for me at a grand to her piano. All her grace and gracefulness I shall miss as she and her era pass by. Yeah, irreplaceable. And my uncle, especially my uncle Hugo, Uncle Hugh, was an immense favorite of mine. I was above them all, probably, and became like a true father to me. I definitely miss him, and wanted to read you this poem. Calls him to mind. Just need a sip of water before I do that. It's called The Shirt. As a college boy, my Brooks Brothers button-downs used to balloon out from behind like bountiful spinnakers. 25 years later, I fill them out breezily, but much less blousily. Now, man, not boy-like. Or one. The only one left, a pale red pencil-striped chemise, feather-soft from ages of laundering that belonged to Uncle H. A loyal to the last customer until he left his classic shirt and suede shoes and silk pajamas behind. I came across some interesting letters of motherly advice that some well-known writers wrote, and Anne Sexton was one. It was a 1969 missive she wrote aboard an airplane for her daughter Linda to get to later in life. And she said, "Dear Linda, I'm in the middle of a flight to St. Louis to give a reading. I was reading a New Yorker story that made me think of my mother, and all alone in the seat I whispered to her, 'I know, Mother, I know.' And I thought of you, someday flying somewhere all alone, and me dead perhaps, and you wishing to speak to me. And I want to speak back. I want to say back, first, I love you. 2, you never let me down. 3, I know, I was there once. I too was 40 with a dead mother who I needed still. This is my message to the 40-year-old Linda. No matter what happens, you were always my bobolink, my special Linda Gray. Life's not easy. It's awfully lonely. I know that. Now you too know it, wherever you are, Linda, talking to me. But I've had a good life. I wrote unhappy, but I lived to the hilt. You too, Linda. Live to the hilt, to the top. I love you, 40-year-old Linda, and I love what you do, what you find, what you are. Be your own woman. Belong to those you love. Talk to my poems and talk to your heart. I'm in both, if you need me. I lied, Linda. I did love my mother, and she loved me. She never held me, but I miss her, so that I have to deny I ever loved her, or she me. Silly Anne. So there. Love, Mom." But that. Maya Angelou wrote to a daughter she never had. She said, "You may not control all the events that happen to you, but you can decide not to be reduced by them. Try to be a rainbow in someone's cloud. Do not complain. Make every effort to change things you don't like. If you can't make a change, change the way you've been thinking. You might find a new solution. Never whine. Whining lets a brute know that a victim is in the neighborhood. Be certain that you do not die without having done something wonderful for humanity." I was going to talk a little bit about coming of age stories, but I would like to keep us on some time. We all know what those are meant to be, but I was just going to throw out, Homer's Odyssey, Candide, Oliver Twist, Great Expectations, The Red Badge of Courage, of course, Huckleberry Finn, The Catcher in the Rye, Life of Pi, Harry Potter, Ordinary People, Clockwork Orange, To Kill a Mockingbird, Romeo and Juliet, The Wizard of Oz, the Apu Trilogy, Breaking Away, Fame, The Dead Poets Society, Flashdance, Stand By Me, A Bronx Tale, Juno, Y Tu Mama Tambien, The Fault in Our Stars, Good Will Hunting, The Lion King, The Love Story, Pan's Labyrinth, E.T., The Graduate, many, many others. Many, many others. I liked what Ben Hecht had to say. He was a great journalist of his day on the soul of childhood. He said, I've some further notions about my opposites, the men and women in whom I can detect no relation to the soul of their childhood. When I was a newspaper man, I greeted them as they got off trains and tagged along with them to hotel suites. It was my chore to interview them, for they were the people who ran the world. They were armed with certitudes and as alike mentally as the teeth of a comb. They were the mindless, moodless hunters of success. I could not then understand how men and women who differed in no way from the dullest of failures I knew in my daily life could be such thumping successes. Later I understood they were successful for the same reason their kind were usually failures. It was founded on the fact they were not themselves. They had borrowed identity from the world and not out of their own souls, and this feat produced equally the leader and the led. I found most, quote, greatness in people to be of this quality. Lacking individuality, they can only become big with the world. They feel their importance as their identity. Of true greatness, there is a fine definition in the Old Testament. It is told in Exodus that Moses spent 40 days with God, and that when he returned to the common ways of man, his face was radiant, but he did not know it. To such radiance, I have always bowed. Baudelaire had some interesting things to say, as did Virginia Woolf, but we're going to just skip by those right now. I wanted to tell you the anecdote that Pablo Neruda had. His memory was a profound one from his childhood, and we may have each had something even quietly profound to touch back into. One time he said, and it influenced, by the way, his poetry and his understanding of life, this moment I'm about to share with you. One time, he said, investigating in the backyard of our house in Temuco, the tiny objects and minuscule beings of my world, I came upon a hole in one of the boards of the fence. I looked through the hole and saw a landscape that, like that behind our house, uncared for and wild. I moved back a few steps because I sensed vaguely that something was about to happen. All of a sudden, a hand appeared, a tiny hand of a boy about my own age. By the time I came close again, the hand was gone, and in its place there was a marvelous white sheep. The sheep's wool was faded. Its wheels had escaped. All of this only made it more authentic. I had never seen such a wonderful sheep. I looked back through the hole, but the boy had disappeared. I went into the house and brought out a treasure of my own, a pine cone, open, full of odor and resin, which I adored. I set it down in the same spot and went off with the sheep. Well, he never saw the hand or the boy it belonged to again. The lamb toy perished in a fire. But that encounter was a lifelong effect on him. So we're going to come into the last stretch of things here for us. Our man David White, wrote this letter to a young reader. Dear young friend, I wish I were in your shoes now. I wish I were standing where you're standing now. I would swap everything I've learned through my reading. I would swap my entire library of 1,000 books, every journey and adventure I've taken through their pages, all the insights about the world and myself, all the laughter, the tragedy, the moments of shock and relief, all the books that have amazed me and that have made me reread them again and again to be at the beginning as you are, so that I could read them all again for the very first time. I wish I were in your place with all the books in the world waiting patiently for me. It would be so astonishing to come across Coleridge as a perfect stranger and hear his voice for the first time. I would love to know nothing about Shakespeare or Jane Austen, to be overwhelmed by the fact that there is a Rosalind or an Elizabeth Bennet or later an Emily Dickinson in this world, and then to see my hand for the first time attempting to write even a little like they have, to follow them in shyness and trepidation and beautiful frustration, to walk through the incredible territory we call writing and reading and see it all again with new eyes. I wish I were in your shoes in a beautiful waiting to know, waiting to read, waiting to write, so that I could open the door and walk through all the books I've ever read or written as if I hadn't. I wish I were in your shoes now. Yours in anticipation, David White. Jane Hirschfield's poem, Amor Fati. Little soul, you've wandered lost a long time. The wood's all dark now, birded and eyed. Then a light, a cabin, a fire, a door standing open. The fairy tales warn you, do not go in. You who would eat will be eaten. You go in, you quicken. You want to have feet. You want to have eyes. You want to have fears. This is a piece from my French goddaughter on her 4th birthday back in time. Our dreamy little demoiselle. Beautiful dreamer whose feelings float like soap bubbles and rose petals through the air, who speaks with whisper-soft words and eyes that brush our faces like butterfly wings. Axel, our darling little demoiselle, whose cheek we kiss, who we love so well. Liesl Müller, sometimes when the light. remembering childhood. Sometimes when the light strikes at odd angles and pulls you back into childhood and you are passing a crumbling mansion completely hidden behind old willows or an empty convent guarded by hemlocks and giant firs standing hip to hip, you know again that behind that wall, under the uncut hair of the willows, something secret is going on, so marvelous and dangerous that if you crawled through and saw, you would die or be happy forever. Found Letter. This is by Joshua Wiener from the Book of Giants, his book of collection. Found Letter. What makes for a happier life, Josh, comes to this. Gifts freely given that you never earned. Open affection with your wife and kids. Clear pipes in winter, in summer screens that fit. Few days in court with little consequence. A quiet mind, a strong body. Short hours in the office. Close friends who speak the truth. Good food, cooked simply. A memory that's rich enough to build the future with. A bed in which to love, read, dream, and reimagine love. A warm, dry field for laying down and sleep to trim the long night coming. Knowledge of who you are, the wish to be none other. Freedom to forget the time, to know the soul exceeds where it's confined, yet does not seek the terms of its release, like a child's kite catching at the wind that flies because the hand holds tight the line. And next to last, Muriel Rukeyser's poem, Children, the Sandbar That Summer. Sunlight the tall women may never have seen, men perhaps going head first into the breakers, but certainly the children at the sandbar. Shallow glints in the waves suspended, we knew at the breaker line, running that shore at low tide when it was safe. The grasses whipped, and nothing was what they said, not safety nor the sea. And the sand was not what they said, but various, lion-grained, beard, gold, gray, and blue and green. And each grain casting its shadow down before childhood in tide pools where all things are food. Behind us the shores emerged and fed on tide. We fed on summer, the round flowers in our hands. From the snowball bush entered us, and prisoner wings and shells and spirals, all food. All keys to unlock some world, glinting as strong as noon on the sandbar, where men and women give each other children. Thank you, Muriel Rukeyser. And in closing for now, let's float back, feel back into childhood moments, encounters, experiences that were especially wonderful, resonant, particularly around nature, I would say, for me anyway. Well, here's one of mine to end our time now. I'm 7 again. It was written late April 2017. Early spring, up in the boughs of the old apple tree of my childhood, a place to float in the clouds, of fresh and fragrant white blossoms, feeling my young body sing with the new sprung bird song, with my sweet boyness, innocence, that the scent of today's tree takes me half a century back to. Thank you again for listening in, for floating and feeling in. All appreciation, too, for those of you lending their financial support to these programs and my poetic arts devoted to nourishing spirits, lifting hearts up, and opening paths to greater self-awareness and aliveness. You can easily donate if you like, any time and any amount, by PayPal or Venmo, or directly through my site, or by mail to P.O. Box 1032 Westerly, Rhode Island 02891. I also actively invite patrons to bring me their way for a month or longer this summer, fall, or winter as a private poet in residence on their property to create a new flight or flights of creating to share with and dedicate to them. Connecting with like-spirited collaborators is also always of interest, chance to partner and explore projects from the musical to the theatrical, and for producers and directors who are in search of a poetic narrator. I do welcome queries, comments, suggestions. Email Colin at thepoetorialist.com. Replays, of course, are online, all of them. I hope you'll lean in again next week or soon again. Until then, dear listeners, here's to appreciating, even reveling in, the best parts of your childhood, the spirit and sweetness of childhood itself, and keeping a childlike aspect at play, that we weave of simple wonder and pleasure and carefreeness and innocence at play in your life. Remember, we can embody the essence of our youthfulness regardless of age, and can come of age of various kinds over and over. Goodbye for now, and good spirits.